The wind off Lake Superior didn't ask permission. It came through the gaps in the old pine siding like it owned the place, and on mornings like this one, grey sky pressing down on grey water, Sloane Mercer barely noticed any more. She had stopped noticing a lot of things. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt road that wasn't on any map she trusted, 12 miles from the nearest town, which was Heron Falls, Minnesota, population 800 and something, and not one of those 800 people had been up that road in the 14 months since Sloane moved in. She had made sure of that. There was a gate at the bottom, padlocked with a sign that read private. No trespassing in letters she'd painted herself, big enough that even someone not paying attention would have to work hard to miss them. She'd painted it on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, she'd added a second sign. The only living thing Sloane allowed past that gate was Atlas. Atlas was a Belgian Malinois, 72 pounds of muscle and scar tissue, with one ear that stood perfectly upright, and one that had never fully recovered from the IED outside Kandahar that had also taken 3 fingers from Sloane's right hand. He slept across the doorway of her bedroom every night. He ate before she did. When the lake threw a storm against the cabin walls and the thunder came in low and rolling the way it sometimes did, Atlas pressed himself against her leg and they stayed like that, neither of them sleeping, neither of them pretending, until it passed. That was the whole of their arrangement, and it worked. Until the morning, it didn't. Sloane had served 8 years with the Marine Corps, the last 4 as a dog handler attached to Special Operations. She and Atlas had run 17 deployments together, not tours. Deployments, the kind with no fixed timeline, and a different set of rules, depending on which week it was, and who was doing the briefing. She'd done things she didn't talk about. She'd lost people she still couldn't name out loud without her throat closing. And when the Corps finally let her go, honorable discharge, full benefits, thank you for your service. She'd taken Atlas, signed the adoption paperwork that took 9 months to push through, and driven north until the radio stopped picking up stations. She hadn't been looking for Lake Superior specifically. She'd just been driving, and the road ran out. The cabin belonged to her uncle, a man named Gordon Mercer, who died of a stroke 3 winters back and left the property to Sloane in a handwritten will that a lawyer in Duluth had needed 2 weeks to verify was actually legal. She'd never been close with Gordon. She'd met him maybe 4 times, but he'd known something about her that her own parents hadn't figured out, that she needed to be somewhere quiet, somewhere the noise of the world couldn't find her unless it really, really tried. She thought about Gordon sometimes, thought about sending him a thank you from wherever he'd ended up. The property was 11 acres. 2 of them were cleared. The rest was pine and birch, and the kind of undergrowth that grabbed at your ankles if you weren't watching where you put your feet. Sloane had worn a path from the cabin to the water, and another from the cabin to the woodpile, and those were the only paths she needed. She chopped wood every morning. She ran the lakeshore every afternoon if the weather held. She made her own food, rationed her supply runs to once a month, and paid for everything in cash so the transaction left no footprint. She wasn't hiding from anything specific. That was what she told herself. Atlas would look at her sometimes. That particular stillness of his, head tilted, brown eyes tracking her face the way they'd tracked rooftops and doorways overseas, and she got the sense that he understood the difference between hiding from something and hiding from everything. He didn't judge her for it. He just stayed close. The fever started on a Wednesday. She woke up wrong. That was the only way to put it. Her body felt like it belonged to someone else, heavy and slow, and when she tried to sit up, the room shifted sideways. Atlas was already on his feet. He'd been watching her, she realized, had probably been watching her for hours. She told him she was fine. He sat down at the side of the bed and put his chin on the mattress and looked at her with the expression that meant he did not believe her. She made it to the bathroom. She made it back. She drank water and took 2 ibuprofen from the cabinet above the sink, and lay back down and decided that whatever this was, she would sleep it off. By afternoon, she couldn't keep water down. By evening, her hands had started shaking. She had a thermometer somewhere. She found it in the kitchen drawer under a flashlight, and 3 dead batteries, and a folding knife she didn't remember buying. Her temperature was 103.4. She sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet and let that number arrange itself into meaning. Atlas pressed against her side. She could feel his warmth through her shirt. She thought about the medical kit under the bathroom sink. She thought about the satellite phone she'd stopped charging 2 months ago because no one was calling it. She thought about the 14 miles of dirt road and pine forest between her and anything that resembled help, and she thought about how she'd driven that road in the dark once with a broken taillight and nearly gone into the ditch twice. What happens to Atlas, she thought, if I don't make it off this mountain? She didn't let herself sit with that question for long. She got up. Getting Atlas into the truck took 3 tries because her hands weren't cooperating, and the passenger door had a trick to the latch that required more coordination than she currently had. She finally got it open by bracing her forearm against the frame and using her body weight instead of her fingers. Atlas jumped in. She walked around to the driver's side and stood there for a moment with her hand on the door and took stock of what she had. Fever, nausea, shaking hands, 12 miles of logging road, and a Malinois who would not under any circumstances be separated from her. She decided she could work with that. The drive was. She would not remember it clearly afterward. She remembered the high beams cutting through the dark between the trees. She remembered Atlas standing on the seat beside her with his nose pressed to the gap in the window, grounding her with the warm solidity of his presence. She remembered a deer standing in the road about 3 miles from the highway, and she remembered stopping, and she remembered the deer taking its time about moving, and she remembered thinking, with the fever-blurred clarity that sometimes arrived near the edge of things. Fair enough. She made it to Heron Falls Memorial at 11:14 p.m. She knew the time because the clock on the dashboard had been the one thing she'd never let run out of battery. She got out of the truck and took 2 steps and caught herself on the hood. Atlas was at her side before she straightened up. She wrapped the leash once around her left wrist, the hand with all its fingers, and they walked through the sliding glass doors of the emergency entrance together. The woman at the intake desk looked up. Her eyes moved from Sloane to Atlas and back to Sloane in a way that was trying to decide which of the 2 situations was the bigger problem. "I need a doctor," Sloane said, "and I need my dog to stay with me." Her name was Dr. Petra Navarro, and she was 37 years old, and she did not look like someone who was easily rattled. She had dark hair pulled back in a clip that had given up trying to contain all of it, and she moved through the ER with the particular economy of motion that came from years of doing too much in too little space. She looked at Sloane's chart. She looked at Sloane. She looked at Atlas, who was sitting at the foot of the exam bed with his hackles up and his eyes on every person who came within 6 feet of the curtain. "Blood pressure's low," Dr. Navarro said, to Sloane, not to the nurse behind her. "We're going to run some labs. I need to start an IV won't let you," Sloane said. "Your dog. If you come at me with a needle, he's going to think you're a threat." Dr. Navarro considered this. She glanced at Atlas, who was doing the thing he did, perfectly still, perfectly focused, the absolute absence of aggression that was somehow more alarming than aggression would have been. "What's his name?" she asked. "Atlas. What's his command for stand down?" Sloane looked at her for a moment. "Why do you know that's a thing?" "Because my brother served 2 tours with the 2nd Battalion. 7th Marines, Doctor," Navarro said, "and his dog was named Sergeant Pepper, and Sergeant Pepper once put a hole in a wall because someone moved too fast near my brother's shoulder." She said it matter-of-factly, without drama. "So, what's the command?" "Fuss," Sloane said, heel in German. "Standard, MWD," Dr. Navarro nodded once. She moved to the side of the bed, Not the side Atlas was on, the other side, slow and deliberate, keeping her hands visible. She sat down on the rolling stool. She didn't approach, she just waited. Atlas watched her. The seconds stretched, and then, slowly, with the particular dignity of a dog who was making a choice rather than being forced into one, he lowered his head and lay down. Dr. Navarro exhaled, not loudly, just enough. She started the IV. It was sepsis. Sloane had suspected as much. She'd had a cut on her left calf that she'd been ignoring for 2 weeks, a scrape from a rusty nail on the woodpile that she'd cleaned out and covered with a bandage and then forgotten about, because there were always more immediate things to attend to. The infection had been building quietly the whole time, and now it had announced itself in the way that things ignored long enough always eventually did. They moved her to a room. Atlas came with her. When the orderly made the mistake of trying to take the leash, Atlas turned his head and looked at the orderly the way the lake looked at small boats in November, and the orderly decided he had other things to do. Sloane slept in fragments. She was aware, in those in-between places, of Atlas on the floor beside the bed. She was aware of the IV drip and the monitors and the particular quality of hospital air, which was the same in Minnesota, as it had been in Germany, as it had been in a field station outside a city she wasn't allowed to name. She was aware, at some point in the early morning, of a different voice, quieter than the nurse's. Not asking anything, she opened her eyes. A woman was standing just inside the doorway, not approaching, hands folded in front of her. She was maybe 60, silver-haired, wearing the kind of cardigan that suggested she'd been called in from home rather than been here for a scheduled shift. She was looking at Atlas. Atlas was looking back at her. And then something happened that Sloane had never seen happen in 8 years. Atlas stood up, his tail, that precise, controlled tail that moved in one tight arc when he was working and barely at all when he wasn't, began to move, slowly at first, then faster. His whole back end followed. He made a sound in his throat that wasn't quite a whine and wasn't quite a bark and was nothing Sloane had a category for. He pulled toward the woman. Sloane sat up so fast the monitor beeped in protest. Atlas. Fuss, he stopped, but his eyes were still on the woman and his tail was still moving and the sound was still in his throat. "I'm sorry," the woman said, her voice low and careful. "I heard. They told me there was a military dog. I didn't mean to intrude." She paused. "I volunteer here on Thursday mornings. I was here early." Another pause. "My son was a handler with the 2nd MSOB. 2nd Marine Special Operations Battalion." Sloane's hands went still on the rail of the bed. "What was his dog's name?" she said. The woman's face changed. Not broke, steadied, the way faces sometimes did around things too large for ordinary expressions. "Ghost," she said. "His name was Ghost." Atlas made the sound again. Sloane looked at him, looked at the woman, looked at the number tattooed on the inside of Atlas's left ear, the number she'd looked at 10,000 times without reading it as anything other than Atlas's designation, and felt the floor of something drop away inside her. "What was your son's name?" Sloane said. "Corporal Eli Voss," the woman said. "He was killed in Helmand Province, 4 years ago March." Sloane closed her eyes. She had not known Eli Voss well. You didn't always. In that work, you knew the dogs better than you knew the handlers sometimes, because the dogs were constants, and the handlers rotated, and the missions were compartmentalized, and there wasn't always time for the kind of knowing that left marks. But she had known Ghost. She had run one operation alongside Ghost and his handler, a quiet corporal from somewhere in Wisconsin, who moved carefully and talked to his dog in a low, steady voice, the way some people talk to themselves when they were thinking through a problem. And when Ghost had been reassigned after Eli Voss died, Sloane had been the handler who took him for 11 months, before Ghost, before Atlas, before the ID that had changed both their ears and some of Sloane's hand, and the whole shape of what came next. She opened her eyes. "My name is Sloane Mercer," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "I handled Ghost for 11 months. She stopped. I called him Atlas. I don't know why exactly. He answered to it. She looked at the dog, who was still watching the woman with everything he had. He still does. The woman, her name, she said when she could say it, was Ruth Voss, crossed the room slowly. She stopped a few feet from the bed. She held out her hand, low and open, the way someone taught to do it right would hold it. Atlas took 2 steps forward. He put his nose to her palm, and then, with a dignity that Sloane would never fully be able to explain to anyone who hadn't seen it, he pushed his head up under her hand and stayed there. Ruth Voss pressed her lips together. Her eyes were very bright. "He knows," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Yeah," Sloane said. Her voice was doing something she wasn't going to comment on. "He knows." She stayed 4 days. Ruth came every morning. Not to talk, most of the time. She would arrive with coffee from the cart in the lobby, one for herself and one for Sloane, and she would sit in the chair by the window, and sometimes they talked, and sometimes they didn't. Atlas learned, over those 4 days, to walk to the door when he heard her footsteps in the hall. He learned to look back at Sloane first, checking, always checking, and Sloane would nod and he would go. On the 3rd morning, Ruth brought a photograph. She set it on the tray table without ceremony, without preamble. It was a snapshot, slightly faded, of a young man in desert utilities crouched next to a pale grey Belgian Malinois. The man was grinning at whoever was holding the camera. The dog was looking at the man. Sloane picked it up. The dog in the photograph was Ghost. She was certain of that before she could have explained how she was certain. The set of the ears, one of them marked with an old scar, the particular way he held his head when he was at ease. "He always said Ghost chose him," Ruth said, "not the other way around." She looked at the photograph. "I used to think that was just something he said. The way young men talk, it's not," Sloane said. Ruth nodded. They were quiet for a while. After Eli died, Ruth said eventually, "I didn't know what happened to Ghost," I asked. Nobody seemed to know, or nobody would say. The paperwork was. She made a small gesture that covered a great deal. "I thought about that dog more than I probably should have." Sloane looked at Atlas, who was lying in a spot of weak winter sunlight that had found its way through the blinds. "He's good," she said. "He's the best dog I've ever worked with, and I've worked with 23 dogs." She paused. "Eli trained him well." Ruth looked at Atlas for a long moment. Something in her face settled, not into peace exactly, but into something that had room in it for peace, somewhere further down the road. "He trained everyone around him well," she said quietly. "That was just who he was." Dr. Navarro cleared her for discharge on the 4th morning. She went through the instructions herself rather than leaving it to a nurse. Antibiotics, follow-up in 2 weeks, no heavy lifting, and then she paused and said, "You know the nearest follow-up clinic is in Duluth." "I know, 45 minutes, I know." "You're going to go, right, Doctor?" Navarro looked at her directly in the way that she had, the way that didn't permit vagueness. "Not back up that road and forget about it." Sloane thought about the gate at the bottom of the logging road, the padlock, the 2 signs she'd painted on a Tuesday and a Wednesday. She thought about Atlas waiting while she painted them, sitting in the gravel, patient as a stone. "I'll go," she said. Dr. Navarro seemed to decide that was enough. Ruth was in the lobby when Sloane came down with Atlas at her side and a bag of discharge paperwork she'd actually read for once. Ruth stood up. She was holding a small piece of paper, folded once. "My number," she said, "in case." She didn't elaborate on in case of what, or she didn't need to. Sloane took it, looked at it, folded it again and put it in the chest pocket of her jacket against her sternum. "You could come up sometime," Sloane said. The words surprised her slightly on the way out. "If you wanted to see him, there's a road. The gate has a padlock, but I can give you the combination." Ruth looked at Atlas. Atlas looked at Ruth. His tail moved, that single, precise arc. "I'd like that," Ruth said. The drive back up the mountain was easier than the drive down had been. That was partly the antibiotics and the IV fluids, and 4 days of sleep that wasn't interrupted by the lake throwing itself against the walls. But it was also something else. something that didn't have a clinical name, something she felt most clearly when Atlas, riding beside her in the passenger seat, put his chin on her shoulder without being asked. She reached up with her 3-fingered hand and scratched behind the ear that still stood perfectly upright. "Good boy," she said. Her voice was quiet. The road was quiet. The pines on either side held the dark the way they always had. She thought about a young corporal from Wisconsin, crouching in the dirt, grinning at a camera, his dog looking at him like he was the whole world. She thought about the 11 months she'd run with Ghost, with Atlas, before everything changed. The way he moved, the way he trusted. The way he'd kept trusting her even when she'd changed his name, as though he understood that she needed something to call her own, and he was willing to be that, and the name was just a name. She thought about Ruth Voss sitting in a hospital chair, drinking bad coffee, asking nothing, bringing a photograph that she'd carried for 4 years without knowing where to bring it. The gate came into view in the headlights. She got out and unlocked the padlock and swung the gate open and drove through and got out again to close it behind her. She stood there for a moment with the padlock in her hand. Then she snapped it onto the hasp without locking it. It was a small thing. Maybe it didn't mean anything, or maybe it meant exactly what it felt like it meant, that something she'd been holding completely shut was now just closed. The difference was only a quarter turn of a key, but a quarter turn was a quarter turn. Atlas was watching her from the truck when she climbed back in. "Don't read into it," she told him. His tail moved once. She drove the rest of the way up to the cabin with the windows cracked, letting in the cold pine smell of the dark, and Atlas rode with his nose in the gap and his warm weight against her arm, and the lake, when she could hear it through the trees, sounded the way it sometimes did in early morning. Not angry, not indifferent, just there, just present, just waiting for whatever came next.